Everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Arshi Pal. I'm an attorney with Littman Krooks, and today's topic for Lunch with Littman Krooks is IEP meetings. We do have a lot to cover, so I ask that if we can hold on for the questions toward the end, and then I will try to address all of them. So first of all, there's a lot of acronyms in the special education world, so I just want to go through the basics of those. The IDEA, which is a federal statute, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It sets the framework for special education services throughout the nation. Additionally, IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. So this is the document that lays out a student's special needs, talks about their strengths, weaknesses, their diagnoses. It talks about management needs, talks about their program recommendations, talks about various things that will help not only a special education teacher, a general education teacher, school personnel, and related services providers to get a better understanding of the student. I just wanted to start off with a basic framework, a basic idea to remember, and kind of a tribute to the late Justice Ginsburg. There was a quote that she mentioned in her decision, Lunsford v. District of Columbia. It was a 1984 DC Circuit decision where she stated that because public resources are not infinite, federal law does not secure the best education money can buy. It calls upon government more modesty to provide an appropriate education for each child. So that is the basics of the IDEA. It's actually a floor and not a ceiling. And, you know, as special education advocates, as parents, and as individuals who want the best, obviously every parent wants the best for their child, we have to understand that it's not always about, you know, maximizing their potential. It's about what's appropriate and helping them make meaningful progress. So let's get kind of into the specifics of an IEP meeting. It usually starts off with either a reevaluation request made either by a school official or even a parent, or it could be what's called an annual review. An annual review every year, the school district has to have an IEP in place for the student. And if the parent feels that they need to reconvene based on circumstances such as new diagnoses, new evaluations, or new circumstances, then the parent can always ask for a reconvene. And so it usually starts off with the district having to provide the parent with a notice at least 5 days prior to the IEP. And on that notice, the school district must inform the parents of the time, the place, the date, and the members who are expected to be joining in the IEP meeting. Sometimes IEP meeting and CSE meeting are used interchangeably. And like I said, another acronym, CSE stands for Committee on Special Education. That's usually for students ages 5 through 21. When we're dealing with a student who's in pre-K or under the age of 5 years old, kind of 3 to 4, it's CPSE, which stands for Committee on Preschool Education. So upon receiving that notice from your school district, the parent should do a couple of things. One, confirm, internally confirm whether the date and time and place works for them. And if for some reason, that particular time and date doesn't work, please let them know as soon as possible. Because like I just mentioned, there's going to be various members who will be attending that CSE. So they're taking out that time, excuse me, from their schedule to make sure that they're available. And then also let them know whether or not, you know, usually these IEP meetings happen in person. Well, nowadays they happen via Zoom, Google Meets, telephone. Let them know whether you'll be attending in person or via remote, you know, some remote method. And some of the people that, you know, should be at this IEP meeting include the special education teacher, the parent, you. It could include the student depending on their age and ability to participate. There must be a school district representative. Usually that's a counselor. It could be an AP. There would also be a school psychologist. The related services providers can also be joining. When it's a student in high school or middle school and they have multiple teachers, so it could be either all or some of the teachers that the student has. And a very important thing to note is that the parent also has the ability to invite individuals who have special knowledge or expertise of the student. So, you know, if you're working with a neuropsychologist, if you're working with a psychiatrist, if you're working with an individual who has specialized information about the student, you want to invite them, but you also want to let the school district know that you're inviting this person. Additionally, if you are going to have a parent advocate, if you're going to have an attorney on the at the meeting, you have to let the school district know ahead of time so they can also prepare accordingly. And then one of the best practices to an IEP meeting is to have the information. So for example, if you have any outside evaluations that you've got conducted for your child, you should provide the school district with a copy prior to the IEP meeting to ensure that they have enough time to review the document and, you know, fully understand it. You don't want to provide them the document at the IEP meeting where they're, you know, focusing on so many different things that that important evaluation might be, you know, unintentionally neglected or not given the due weight that it requires. Additionally, you should ask, when you do receive the notice of this IEP meeting, you should ask what new evaluations, if any, were conducted, whether or not they have any new data in terms of any classroom observations, they have any testing that they were looking at in terms of academic profile of the student. You want to ask if they've created draft goals for the student. You also want to see if they have a draft IEP. There's actually a kind of a misconception that if they have a draft IEP, that's wrong. They already decided. Actually, school districts kind of have a draft IEP. They kind of look at the student's last IEP and work off of it to kind of compare the progress the student has made. So let's say if Johnny in his last IEP was only able to do single-digit addition. Now I'm looking back at the IEP, I'm looking at the draft IEP. I want to see, well, is Johnny, has he retained that skill? Is he continuing to, you know, have the ability to do single-digit addition? And now is he able to do double-digit addition? Or is he able to do, you know, single-digit subtraction? Are we adding to those skills? Are we retaining them? Are we regressing? So it might be helpful to have that old IEP, the previous IEP, to kind of compare what's going on currently. So once you get that notice for the IEP meeting, you want to ask them, what evaluations, what data are we looking at? So you can review that data prior to the meeting. As I mentioned, you don't want the school officials reading your evaluation while you're sitting there for an hour. Similarly, you also want to go in informed so you can meaningfully participate in the IEP meeting. And then also you want to note when you receive the meeting notice for your IEP meeting, you also have the ability to request what's called a parent member to join. So it could be like an individual who also has a student with a disability in the school district who can kind of guide you in terms of if you have any questions, kind of give you advice and things like that. This would be an individual who would kind of assist you in a way. And let's get to the most one. Well, in New York, the commissioners, I'm going to put in the chat, before I forget, let me put this in. One of the documents we should look at when we're dealing with special education students and the regulations is the commissioner's regulations on special education. It's called Part 200 and Part 201. I'm going to post the link, bear with me one moment, in the chat so you can all look along, and I will guide you on where I'm looking. I'm going to be referencing some of those. Whoops. Okay, great. So now that we have that, and this is a very valuable resource. It lays out certain things that the school district should be doing, you know, to ensure that the student is receiving appropriate special education supports and services. So looking at an actual IEP, let's talk about the different components, and then I will talk about the best practices. So classifications, one of the first things on the first page is a classification of the student. And this will help kind of guide the discussion on what the student's needs are. So commonly when we have a conversation with parents, there's a misconception that their diagnosis, the student's diagnosis, should be the classification. Well, if we look to the document that I just posted, which is the Commissioner's Regulation, actually the Commissioner's Regulation only has 13 different special education classifications. And I'll read them briefly, but if you would like to see their definitions, it's autism, deafness, deaf-blindness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, learning disability, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. So there may be students that actually fall under one or two or more of these different classifications if we're thinking about diagnoses. But what we want to keep in mind is when a school district and a parent are trying to come up with the most appropriate classification, it would be like which of these most manifests in the student. So which would best describe. So for example, I've had a student that I've worked with. He had autism along with ADHD, and he also had a speech and language impairment. So when we were at the IEP meeting, we were trying to figure out what would be the best classification. And we ultimately decided as a team that autism best fit his needs in terms of the fact that he had some substantial emotional difficulties. Additionally, he has some cognitive impairments. Although he, you know, his speech language impairment was important, his primary classification we thought would best fit autism. We've had other situations where we've had students with emotional needs, and then we've also had, and those students also had a learning disability. So we had to sit there and actually think about whether we should classify the student as emotional disturbance or whether it should be learning disability. And we found that although the student did have significant emotional needs, his learning disability was actually more significant, and we needed to have specific supports in place, so we classified him as learning disability. It's actually a analysis that, you know, if you're having some difficulty with, have a look at those definitions in the regulations. Additionally, the next thing that we want to ensure that we have the correct name and date of birth of the student and their ID on the IEP. You know, school districts, although, you know, it's inexcusable, but school districts are dealing with so many students at the same time. Sometimes they might end up writing the wrong name on the IEP, and that could be an issue in and of itself. And then we have the PLOP, which is present levels of performance. In this section, this is where we will be discussing, or on the IEP, you will see stated the students' strengths, their weaknesses, their progress toward their goals from the last IEP, things they're working on in their related services, and then any parental concerns. One thing to note is that there's also a area in the IEP to discuss any evaluation results. So it would be helpful, for example, to have the student's full-scale IQ, their verbal comprehension, and any other testing that is relevant, that's updated and relevant. So we don't really want to be looking at testing that's maybe 5-6 years old. We want to make sure that we have, and this is also kind of referring to a triennial, that the school district has an obligation to test the student once every 3 years. So we want to make sure that if the testing, if we're looking at evaluation data that's more than 3 years old, maybe now this is the time to request a reevaluation to see, you know, whether the student's needs have, whether the student's strengths or weaknesses have regressed, or whether or not they're making progress, whether other, you know, sometimes something that was working 3 years ago may not be working anymore for this particular student because they are evolving and circumstances have changed. Additionally, as I mentioned, this is the area where we want to talk about parental concerns. So in a typical scenario, what we've seen or what we've advised our clients is, let's take notes. So if I'm doing, let's stick with Johnny. If I'm doing homework at home with Johnny and I notice that he's having trouble on, you know, his multiplication facts, or he's having trouble with his reading fluency, or he's having trouble with decoding. Well, I want to take notes for myself as a parent, and when I speak with the school district, when I have a parent-teacher meeting, when I have this IEP meeting, I want to bring those particular concerns to the IEP meeting, because the core tenet of the IDEA is a collaborative process. When the federal law was written and enacted, I think the legislators had this idea, or they had this kind of, they had this fundamental view that it would be a collaboration, that everybody would think in the best interest of the student. So maybe, you know, I'm home with Johnny doing his homework and I'm seeing specific impairments that, because it's a unstructured environment, or because I don't have like a specialized training on to do, to break down the steps with Johnny, I'm struggling to do his homework, and then he's getting frustrated, or then he's shutting down. These things are very important to notify the school district, because maybe they're seeing something else due to the supports that he has in school. Maybe, you know, he's receiving, we'll get into the different supports that they can provide, but SETS, which is a kind of a pull-out resource sometimes used with students with disabilities, where they're having that one-on-one session with him and he's able to do the multiplication, or he's able to decode, or they're not seeing that frustration because he has that structure, because he has that teacher kind of helping him cope, that, you know, you can do this, or different strategies. So this could be a, this IEP meeting could be a valuable resource, can be a good time to kind of work with those teachers and those providers to see what is helping Johnny. You know, what is something that I can bring into the home to help him as well. Maybe there's a special song that they do with him, or maybe they have like a specific therapy theme that you can say, oh, remember Johnny, when you were with Miss Susan, you learned how to do this. Remember that song that you sang? You know, different strategies like that can actually make an impact to a student. Because the whole point of the school, or the whole point of this IEP, is to help the students generalize whatever skills that they learn in school, so they can bring it home to their homework, or their, you know, if we're talking about high school students, we want them to be independent as possible. You know, we're going to get to transition goals shortly. We want them to, outside of school, we want them to hold on to those skills and to use them in their daily lives. So this is a valuable time to talk about things that are working, things that you felt that are not working. And it's a, you know, this is not the time, and I highly discourage kind of blaming, or having like a, because of you, kind of a conversation, because at the end of the day, these are the particular providers that are working with your student, for most of the day, for 5 days a week. We don't want to have a bitter relationship with the school district, while we also want to keep in mind that we want to preserve the rights and we want to do what's in the best interest of the student. And then the next part of the PLOP, we talk about social development. We want to talk about, does Johnny have friends in school? Is Johnny able to greet people? Is he able to, does he sustain eye contact? Is he able to have understand directions? That's very important. How is his receptive language? We want to talk about, how does Johnny cope with his emotions? Does he get frustrated? Does he cry? Does he shut down? Does he internalize? These are all things that we want to discuss at the IEP meeting. Additionally, on the IEP meeting, on the actual IEP, there's a section for management needs. So this is a section where we want to talk about or consider various things that might help Johnny. For example, graphic organizers, or like use of a timer, or some students who have difficulty transitioning, you might want to have like a schedule posted on their table to kind of show, okay, look, we just finished with our reading assignment. We're going to have 10 minutes of snack, and then we're going to go to our math assignment. Various things like that, although, it might not be beneficial for all students. A particular student who has difficulty with, kind of focusing, who has difficulty with transitioning, that might help them. Or if there is going to be a change in routine, let's let all of the providers know that we have to inform Johnny a few minutes ahead of time before the routine has changed, so he can have those few minutes to cope with the fact that the routine has changed. Additionally, other things that could be listed or that could be provided under management needs is sometimes we can ask for study notes and or outlines of the lesson plans, so that Johnny can look along ahead of time, because maybe he has like a writing impairment or a physical impairment where he can't take notes. So here we can also talk about assistive technology. Maybe we want to give him use of a laptop and or tablet. Additionally, we want to think about the students. We want to have a consideration of LRE, which is the least restrictive environment. So there's also under the IDEA, when the legislators were contemplating this law, they were thinking about, having like this kind of a system where students can also learn from students who are in the general education population. We don't want to necessarily restrict students to students with disabilities. Everybody can learn from one another. So we want to see what are the pros and cons of going more restrictive versus going more toward the general education. So sometimes there'll be like a short sentence as to why a student cannot be in general education, or why they are in general education, but there's specific supports that would help them, that would help them with regard to their academics. And then the next thing on the IEP that we need to discuss are the annual goals. So each year there should be specific, and there's an acronym here, we want SMART goals, right? So what does SMART stand for? They should be specific, measurable, attainable/achievable, relevant/realistic, and time-based. So we want them to be specific enough so that whatever provider is working on those goals with Johnny, they know exactly what we're trying to accomplish with him. They're supposed to be measurable. So how many times can Johnny do this? So either, for example, we can say 3 out of 5 times, Johnny should be able to write an essay, including a topic sentence, including 3 details, and having a conclusion for their essay, for their paragraphs. And then we want to make sure that it's attainable. Well, if Johnny unfortunately cannot even spell, how can we have him write an essay? Additionally, we want to make sure they're time-based. So usually we want to have a goal that can, that can be met within one school year, because each year we're going to have a new IEP meeting. So we try, although it does happen sometimes, we try not to repeat the same goal. Let's say it's the end of the school year, or it's the end of when the IEP is set to renew. We want to see why Johnny didn't meet this goal. Was it not specific enough? Was it not realistic? Was it not enough time? So we want to kind of do that self-reflection to see what is working for Johnny and what is not working for Johnny. And then we get to the section of the program recommendation. So here is kind of like the crux of the IEP. Everything is important, but this is going to tell you what kind of supports and services Johnny is going to receive. So going back to that, going back to the commissioner's regulations, they do have specific special class sizes that I'll briefly go over. Various classroom programs that we can provide students with disabilities is general education. This is, a class with a regular teacher, with a general education teacher. It could be anywhere from 20 to 30 students in the city, and they're all working with no real specialized instruction. It's kind of following the Common Core, and that's it. And then, along with that, they can have related services. And this is least restrictive. I'm going to list them from least restrictive to most restrictive. And then the next one right underneath that kind of falls in general education is what's called ICT, Integrated Co-Teaching. So this is kind of like a situation where you have two teachers. One would be a general education teacher, and one would be the special education teacher. So again, kind of focusing on the city. So you would have anywhere from 20 to 25 to 30 students, and you'll have two teachers. And then during a lesson, while a lesson is going on, we'll have like maybe the special education teacher pull out some of the students who are struggling with a specific, they're in the same classroom, but they're kind of like to the side, grouping the students to kind of work on specific things that they're struggling with. An important thing to note in an ICT class is that there are both special education and general education students in that class. And then the next level down from that would be a 12 to 1 to 1, where it's students who can be from different grades, but they're kind of at a similar functioning level. And just kind of, I want to quickly go over the definition from the commissioner's regulations. A class size, a special class with 12 students includes students whose management needs interfere with instructional progress, or the process, excuse me. And then the next, another 12 to 1 to 3 class, which is actually a little bit more restrictive than the other ones, but I don't want to forget this specialized special class. It's actually defined as students with severe multiple disabilities whose programs consist primarily of habilitation and treatment. So this might be like a student who's in a specialized hospital program. It could be a student with physical impairments, such as they're wheelchair bound, or they're, we do have students, unfortunately, that are on ventilators that need severe treatment. And so those are for those particular students. And important to note here, for 12 to 1 to 3, these students are not necessarily kind of focusing on academics. They might be focusing on daily living skills or just their treatment. And then the next special class that they have is the 8 to 1. So this is 8 students, 1 teacher, and 1 paraprofessional. And the regulations define this as students whose needs are highly intensive and require a significant degree of individualized attention and intervention. And then the most restrictive, that would be in district, would be 6 to 1 to 1. And this one is defined as students whose management needs are highly intensive and require a high degree of individualized attention and intervention. So typically we might see, not always true, but in a 6-to-1-to-1, it might be students who are nonverbal, who are unable to express their needs. So we need to have a smaller student to teacher ratio. And then the most restrictive kind of program is actually when it's an NPS, which stands for non-public school, or a residential program. So a residential program is when the student would actually have room and board as well. So they would be sleeping at whatever program it is, and that would be, you know, based on the student's specific needs and the unique needs. That determination would be made. And then additionally, part of the recommendation could include related services. So some of the related services that might be provided to students with disabilities would be APE, which is adaptive physical education. This is for a student who might have executive functioning issues, who have physical impairments. And then additionally, another related services might be physical therapy to work on any physical impairments. Speech language therapy to work on communication skills, expressive, receptive language. Then we have occupational therapy, which will work on executive functioning, that'll work on grasping writing utensils, writing on the line, writing in the appropriate space, various things like that. And then we would also have counseling, where a student can either learn their social skills, or they can learn to work with their emotional, like a frustration tolerance, coping skills, and things of that nature. Additionally, I mentioned earlier, they can be, here we would list any assistive technology devices, such as a laptop, an FM unit for a student who may need that. It would be a tablet, various things like that. Additionally, if it's a student with autism, under the regulations, we want to list how often this parent would be offered parent training and counseling, because sometimes, you know, like I mentioned earlier, there are specific interventions or specific techniques that can help students with disabilities. And, you know, sometimes parents have questions. That parent training and counseling could be very helpful to the parents to help the student. And then after that, if we have children that are in middle school and high school, we want to focus on their transitional goals, and we want to have like a transitional plan in place for those kind of students. So for example, we want to kind of make a determination on what is the most realistic plan for the student. Is the student going to be attending college? Is the student going to be working a job, a 9-to-5 job? Is the student going to be going to like a vocational school? Is the student going to be in a residential facility? We want to kind of start putting the processes in place for that student. So for example, I just had a student that we were helping, and he wants to be a school psychologist. So and we actually invited the student to the IEP meeting, and we were talking about his transition plan. We were talking about his transition goals. And the school psychologist was present at the meeting, and he said that I want to be a school psychologist. So this was a great opportunity for the school psychologist to jump in and say, wow, that's amazing. So part of this transition goal or this transition plan, we worked with the school district that she's going to meet with him once every 2 weeks to talk about, well, a little bit about her experience. She's going to talk about what skills she thinks are necessary to to be a school psychologist. She's going to talk to him about various colleges that he might be interested in applying to. He's actually a little bit, he was in 10th grade. I'm sorry, the days are kind of mixed up because of the pandemic, but he was in 10th grade. So she wanted him to focus on particular schools, their essay requirements, their SAT things. All of those things are very important. So in our transition plan, we had that he would work with the school psychologist once every 2 weeks, He would start looking at the different essays or personal statements he had to write for the different colleges. He would look at career zone for other careers in case he felt like school psychologist wasn't exactly what he wanted to be. And this is a great time to think about other skills that this student might need. So I mentioned that this particular student was interested in attending college. Well, does this student need assistance with transportation? Is he able to independently use the subway? Maybe we want to have like a session with him on safety, public safety, in terms of how to read a map if we're going on a subway, various things like that. And then a very important part of an IEP is the testing accommodations. Here is where we want to talk about different things that might help the student. Although they have the skills, maybe during the test time they're unable to demonstrate them because of the time constraints. Maybe they have anxiety. Maybe they're unable to focus because of their ADHD. They can't be in a classroom with 30 students. So maybe we want to discuss will the student benefit from a separate location? Will the student benefit from time and a half, which means they get the full time that all the other students are receiving, and maybe they get half more of that time? We want to discuss, does the student need to have the directions read out loud to them? Does the student need a scribe? Maybe they know the answers, but they're unable to write them down. So these are all important things to consider for students with disabilities. And then another very important conversation to have with your school district or with the CSE members, the Committee on Special Education members, is the student on what's called alternate assessment. So we do have a wide spectrum when we're discussing students with disabilities. We have students who, cognitively and academically, that they're very high functioning, but unfortunately they have these emotional difficulties. So they have these, maybe like testing anxiety, or as I mentioned, other emotional difficulties. So they wouldn't need what's called alternate assessment necessarily. Alternate assessment are for students who are a little bit lower functioning, and unfortunately there's a determination made that they wouldn't be able to take the state exams and or the regents to earn a diploma. So for those particular students, what the alternate assessment would do is set them up toward a CETOS credential, which is kind of like a vocational credential. And then you also want to talk about whether or not this particular student should be on a modified promotion criteria. So do we want Johnny to be, with everything going on in his unique circumstances, do we want to see if Johnny is able to meet 55% of math, and maybe because he has that learning disability in math, so maybe we only want him to meet 55%, 60%, 70%, that's a determination you want to make. And then and then reading, he's going to meet 100% of the the grade expectations for reading. Or maybe in reading you want Johnny to meet 70% of the grade expectations, and then in math he needs to meet, let's say, 60%. This is a very important conversation to have during the IEP meeting. And then the IEP meeting, this is kind of like during the whole time, we want to kind of get a grasp of where Johnny or this particular student is in terms of their functioning. So are they reading at grade level? Are they doing computations? Are they on math? What level are they functioning at? And then we want to ensure that whatever concerns that you as a parent are expressing, we want to make sure that you have them there and that they're written onto the IEP. So usually when we have these IEP meetings, we have to wait a couple of days before we get the finalized IEP. We want to be careful, and I started this off saying this is a collaborative approach, but unfortunately, in reality, sometimes the relationships or sometimes things can go sour. So we want to take our own notes. We want to, if possible, we want to record the meeting. And if we are recording the meeting, we should notify the district ahead of time that we intend to record the meeting. And then if there's anything we're disagreeing with, we want to notify the the school district or the CSE members at the meeting. We want to voice our concerns. And then we're only going to be signing the attendance page at the IEP meeting. We're not going to be signing the acceptance of the IEP. We want to take our time. We want to review the actual, if they do somehow have the finalized IEP ready at the end of the meeting, you don't want to sign it right away. You want to take your time just to review it and make sure everything adequately represents what was discussed at that meeting. And if there's something you don't understand, always speak up, ask those questions, because at the end of the day, you're doing this for the best interest of the student, right? If you don't understand, for example, I was working on a case with a individual from the New York City Department of Education, and they were recommending what's called a D75 program for the child. And the parent had no idea what that meant. The D75 in the New York City Department of Education is actually a specialized school for students with disabilities versus a community school. So in a community school, you're more likely to see students with general education and special education, and District 75 is actually one of the most restrictive because it's just mainly students with special education needs. So she, unfortunately, she didn't ask that question. She didn't even realize that they were moving her student, her child, from a community setting to a District 75 specialized setting. And then when we had this conversation with her, like, did you agree with that? She's like, I didn't even know what that meant. So that's just an example. For example, you may not understand what the promotion criteria is or what alternate assessment means, anything. This is your time to ask those questions from the school district, and hopefully they can answer them. But if you're not comfortable, that's when you need to voice your concerns, that I'm not fully grasping what a District 75 is, or I'm not fully grasping what an ICT class would look like. Can you explain it? I'm not comfortable with making this change until I fully understand what's being changed. And then also we want to talk about with the school, do you see, what are some techniques that are actually helping Johnny in school that you think we should bring into the home? As I started this whole discussion, this is about helping Johnny not only in school, but we want to see him use these skills. We want to see him generalizing these skills so that it can help him in the long run. We're not just trying to get him, there was a quote that we don't want him to just we don't just want to push him from grade to grade, even though he's not retaining any skills. We want to see him make meaningful progress. And meaningful progress can be anything it's very unique in terms of the student's circumstances, but necessarily we don't want to just, keep continuing the same program, letting him go through, and then, we're in high school now and Johnny is still reading at a first grade level. We want to try to catch whatever deficits or whatever struggle he's having. We want to kind of catch them and try to provide those interventions ahead of time, and try to see what we can do to better assist Johnny so he has a more meaningful meaningful schooling. And additionally because we don't want to see students that are going to school not really understanding what's happening, and then they become frustrated or they end up having self-esteem issues. We want to be able to provide them with those supports ahead of time so we can prevent further regression in the future. And then I mentioned, unfortunately, things can go sour. So let's say that, we're having this 2-hour-long meeting with the school district where we're being fully honest with them. We're telling them these are our concerns, but unfortunately the school district is saying, well, we don't see these in school. So we're not gonna, either we're not gonna list them in the IEP, or we're not going to provide supports for them. What is the best practice here in this kind of situation? We want to go home and we want to write a letter expressing our disagreement with whatever we're disagreeing with, and we want to keep a copy for ourselves, because the litigator in me wants to say that we want to preserve these our disagreements, or we want to preserve our concerns that look, we put the school district on notice that we didn't agree with this change, or we didn't agree with this evaluation. and that we put them on notice, but they fail to address those concerns. So if we do end up in an impartial hearing situation, you will have that, that proof or that piece of paper kind of showing that you were following, all of the steps, and you were trying to be fully honest, and you were trying to cooperate with the district, and unfortunately things just didn't work out. And although this can be a full seminar on itself, but we should discuss an FBA or a BIP, and these are further acronyms, and I will. FBA stands for Functional Behavior Assessment Analysis, and BIP stands for Behavior Intervention Plan. So when we're discussing Johnny's unique needs, his PLOP, his performance, his social emotional, well, we also want to discuss his behaviors. Does Johnny have behaviors that interfere upon his learning and the learning of others? In that kind of a scenario, maybe we want to ask for what's a FBA, a functional behavior analysis, which will help them create what's called a behavior intervention plan. So what are some behaviors that can interfere with academics and or instruction? Some of the behaviors could be maybe he's distracted, or maybe Johnny has tics, or maybe Johnny starts fidgeting in the class, or maybe Johnny leaves his seat, maybe Johnny can't be sitting for too long. So, over a course of a period, maybe like at least a week or 10 days, the school district will collect data. They will observe Johnny in the classroom. They will see what are his behaviors. Maybe he has tantrums. Maybe he has outbursts. He has that emotional difficulty, and he's unable to cope with transition. So in that functional behavior analysis, they will first look at what is his behavior, what are some things that trigger that behavior, what are some things that will that help that behavior to reduce the behavior, or kind of negate that behavior altogether. And those looking at that kind of a data, then the school district will come together along with the parent and the teachers and discuss a behavior intervention plan. So one, we want to look out for these behaviors. The behavior intervention plan will talk about things to do when you start noticing that Johnny's being triggered. Maybe we want to ask him to step outside, take a deep breath. Maybe we want to ask him to take a walk. Maybe he's getting fidgety in his seat, sitting for so long. Maybe we want to give him a sensory break, for maybe give him like a fidget spinner, things like these to help Johnny so he can stay involved in the lesson, and then also it wouldn't interrupt the learning of the other people, other students in the classroom. And so those are pretty much the basics of an IEP meeting. If anybody has any questions, I'll open up the chat. Feel free to put in a question if you have any, or if you like, if you don't want to put in the chat, feel free to give us a call, email me. All of our information is listed. And then, let's see, we actually have a question. Our district asked us to sign a COVID response IEP document with the actual services being given. Is there any legal significance to signing the form? Yes, there actually is legal significance. So like I mentioned, if there is any disagreement later on, sometimes they have, they have notices where you're waiving IEP services or you're amending IEP services. Signing this document can actually replace whatever services are listed in the IEP. So for example, if your child is entitled to physical therapy, and now because it's COVID, and there's no providers that are able to physically go out to provide the physical therapy, and you're doing remote services, you're doing remote learning, and you sign the document that states that, the student is only going to be receiving speech, occupational therapy, and counseling. Well, in a way, you might be inadvertently waiving your right, or your child's right to physical therapy. So maybe you wanted to make it clear that, okay, with this situation going on right now, it's kind of hard to provide physical therapy to your student, your child. that maybe we can get what's called RSAs, which is related services authorization. So later on, they can get those services, or you want compensatory physical therapy. Whatever that can't be provided now, you want to try to have a conversation about compensatory services with your school district. So if they can't receive the services now, maybe later on they can receive those services. Let's see. Just give it another moment. I don't see any. Oh, one more question. How long does the school have to reevaluate present levels if a child is returning after 7 months? So this is a very interesting question. We want to give them enough time to see how the students, so I'm assuming this is because of COVID, the 7 months lockdown, and now they're actually going into school. So we want to give them enough time to have enough data, right? So we want to have at least minimum 2 weeks of school to see, you know, the students need enough time to get back to the routine. The students need enough time to be in the structured environment. You know, it's very different. You know, as adults, we struggle sometimes getting back to a routine. Students struggle even more, specifically students with disabilities. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues that, you know, an IEP was set to expire in September 20th, I believe, and schools had actually started, you know, on the 10th, but then New York City started on the 21st. It was a lot going on, and this particular child was new to the school, and they really had no data, and they had to base off of the last IEP. And so what they decided to do in the best interest of the child and kind of following the federal guidelines, they did do a new IEP meeting, but they had a internal agreement, and they actually listed on the IEP that we're going to have a reconvene in 3 months to kind of assess to see what other changes or what we should do with this particular student. So unfortunately, my answer to you is it's very case specific. I would say let's give it at least a month to kind of gather all of that data, because students, especially students with special needs, need time to get back into a routine to try to, you know, start learning and things like that. Can parents provide private evaluations to the DOE, and does the DOE have to accept them? So I think I mentioned this earlier, and I apologize if I didn't. It's actually very important to provide these outside evaluations, private evaluations to your school district, because they could be a little bit more thorough than what the school district does. They could have other other diagnoses that the student has and the school district isn't aware of. It's very important to provide those evaluations. Unfortunately, though, sometimes in my practice, I see that although we provide and we advise our clients to provide these evaluations, they don't always, the school districts don't always give them the due weight, and that's a situation in which we end up in impartial hearings. But, you know, what we want to show is, look, the evaluation is reliable. The individual conducting it has the credentials. The individual conducting the evaluation actually observed the student. These are some things that we kind of bring out in impartial hearings to kind of put the weight on that these evaluations are very critical to this particular student's needs. And then, let's see. So that's all I have for you. I hope you found this helpful. And then I do want to thank you for your time, and I want to invite you next week, same time, same place, my colleague Amy Halpert, who's also an attorney in the special education unit. She'll be discussing measuring student progress during COVID times. So let me get your name. Mr. Aaron, you asked that question, that this would actually be a very interesting presentation for you to review. So I want to bid everyone farewell. Have a great day and be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.